I'd like to welcome George with us. He's an author with a double last name. He prefers to be called George. And he is an interesting guy. He joined us earlier on a Zoom Tech Help, so I've got to know him a little bit. So he's a great sense of humor, so I think you'll find him an interesting conversationalist this evening. He's here to talk about two of his books, although he has a couple, not a couple, a few under his belt, up to 11. Some of them are self-published. And he's here to talk about George's Georgian Bay, and then he's going to talk about Kiss the Ground You Walk on Canada, How to Be a Better Canadian. And George has, he's very well-rounded. He's the past president of the Collingwood Rotary Club, and also the past president of the Collingwood Chamber of Commerce, and was deeply involved with the Georgian Triangle Association. He spent 5 years on the Ontario Trillium Foundation's Simcoe Gray grant review team. And he spent a lot of his working life, most of his working life in the newspaper industry, either in the newsroom, publishing, until the internet arrived and changed the industry greatly. He's done employment counseling after that, worked for a high-tech firm, spent 5 years as manager of the Great Northern Exhibition. Fabulous, very community-oriented gentleman. So he's worked with a lot of the volunteers there in the Collingwood Agricultural Society, and now is retired. I don't know if you slowed down, George, but with your other interests, he's an avid photographer, a boater, I believe, from pictures that I've seen, and a lot of books under his belt. As we mentioned, we'll get him to talk about that in a little bit. So I'm going to turn it over to George now to take it away and start our conversation this evening. Welcome, George.
Thank you. Hi there. My surname is Czerny-Holownia in Polish, but I'm Canadian officially now since 1967. And I have a certificate from the late Judy LaMarche to prove it. So you can just call me George. It makes life a lot easier. Thank you to Angela Kemp and to the Wasaga Beach Public Library for hosting this. A library is a tremendous community resource, even when we have COVID challenges. And thanks to Zoom, which brings us all together. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for clicking in today. I shall carry on, make some comments, tell some stories, and then open it for questions. And I'll do my best to answer your questions. My presentation will touch a bit about my relationship with Wasaga Beach, my travel guide, George's Georgian Bay, and my latest book, Kiss the Ground You Walk on Canada, which has a subtitle of the ABCs of how to be a better Canadian. Let's be clear from the outset about some things. My father-in-law, the late Major Julian Daglish, MBE, once stood on the shoreline at Beach Area 5 of Wasaga Beach and looked out at the vast expanse of southern Georgian Bay. It was a calm, glassy water day, and the sun was shining from above nearby pine trees. It was beautiful. Is this the Garden of Eden, he asked, impressed by the peaceful beauty of Wasaga Beach? I agreed with him then, and I still do. My relationship with Wasaga Beach goes back to the 1960s, when it was possible to drive on the actual beachfront at the water's edge. By the 1970s, I was living in the area in Collingwood, and by then, Beach Area 1, the part of it adjacent to where the Nottawasaga River joins Georgian Bay, had been changed from a bunch of sand dunes, great big dunes. You could almost hide in those dunes. It had been changed to a number of paved parking lots. By the 1980s, Wasaga Beach was moving away from being a 5,000 population resort town and becoming more and more and more a full-time residential area with subdivisions springing up. Today, the population is in the neighborhood of 21,000. Those subdivisions would not have been possible had not sewer infrastructure been installed throughout most of the community. I believe then Member of Parliament, Provincial Parliament, the late George McCaig, and then Mayor Walter Borthwick had a lot to do with seeing the realization of sewers throughout the community. I did some research about the sewers, but this speech isn't about the sewers, so thank you to the people who sent me some information about how they came to be. Then Mayor of Wasaga Beach, Walter Borthwick, and his council were also instrumental in the birth of fake news. Yes, fake news originated right here in Wasaga Beach, long before American President Donald Trump mouthed those words. In some of my other involvements with Wasaga Beach, it is not fake news when I tell you that I once raced a stock car at the Wasaga Beach Speedway. A lot of people wouldn't know that there was a speedway here, but the speedway is over by the sewage treatment plant. I was also deeply involved with the Georgian Triangle Tourist Association, of which Wasaga Beach was a part. Back then, I got to know Carl Fury Sr., then the owner of the Waldhorn Hotel. He's gone now, but what a wonderful gentleman. He was so very proud of Wasaga Beach and a great promoter of it. I used to call him Mr. Wasaga Beach. Tourism promotion was very, very different back in the 70s, the 80s, and early 90s. Before the internet age hit in the early 1990s, tourism promotion relied on printed matters and expositions, trade shows, if you will. I decided that Georgian Bay is my center of the universe and decided to write a travel guide about it, spurred on by an incident I witnessed at a convenience store in Craigleith. Two young men with an Ontario road map in hand were quizzing a store clerk, and they were asking about the Cheechimon Ferry and getting to Tobermory. It was in late March of that year, and the ice had just gone off Georgian Bay. I joined the conversation, noting it's going to be a long wait, fellas, because the Cheechimon Ferry doesn't start to operate until mid-May. Then I helped the university students who were from Denmark to adjust their travel plans. That incident sparked my effort to write George's Georgian Bay, which in 2004 came in at 174 pages and sold for $24.95 Canadian. Now keep that price in mind, because I'll tell you another price, what it was like 10 years later. I wanted to promote Georgian Bay as a destination. And in 2004, self-publishing was an embryonic thing. To produce George's Georgian Bay, I wrote the book on the home computer. Then I took it as a file to Trinamic Printing, which is now the print shop in Collingwood. There, my text and my photographs were assembled using a Macintosh program by a staff member who knew what she was doing. I was very happy with the result. This was my first George's Georgian Bay. I'll just pass it by. It showed all of the bay, and it had a color cover and the color photos on the back cover, because printing a book was very, very expensive. And inside, I started off with a thing I called snapshots on how to use George's Georgian Bay. And my snapshots involved telling people where they could get fuel, where they could get hospitals, where they could get motels, restaurants. And then I divided it in by municipality. So Wasaga Beach had a whole segment of its own with these snapshots to tell you where you could get food or whatever. And that was in 2004, $24.95, keep that in mind. Back then, printing a book was a costly process, and I had to buy a set number of copies, and then I had to sell them. Bookstores were marginally helpful, but my best sales came at farmers markets. I sold at Chapters, I sold at other bookstores, but selling a book is a difficult thing. Keep that in mind if you're going to try it. I did not approach a traditional publishing company with my book or with any of my books. Lucky for me, I was still able to sell my books and recover my costs. By 2014, so 10 years later, traditional publishing houses were still in existence, but they had self-publishing companies nibbling at their heels. Self-publishing was getting more and more popular. And in 2014, I updated George's Georgian Bay and called it George's Georgian Bay Revisited. I updated the information, and then I used a self-publishing format called Blurb, B-L-U-R-B, using a computer and the internet. Blurb is a printing company which developed proprietary print-on-demand technology. That means they can print one book at a time. You can order one book, they'll print it and charge you for one book and send it to you. Self-publishing with Blurb had some major appeal. I could download their BookSmart program free of charge to my computer. Then I could design my book exactly the way I wanted it. I could upload it to Blurb for printing by them, almost all for free. You had to pay for just one copy. As I was doing this, so were thousands of other budding authors, as self-publishing was growing in popularity, and Blurb wasn't the only self-publishing company. In 2014, I released George's Georgian Bay Revisited online through blurb.com, and there they gave me a spot in their online bookstore so that I could promote the book, sell the book online, and expect a royalty check from Blurb. My revised George's Georgian Bay Revisited, came in at 214 pages with lots of color photographs. And it was, even as I look at it now, it's a wonderful book. It has all kinds of photographs, front and back, and all the way through it. And there I was in Penetanguishene with a statue pointing the way around Georgian Bay. It was wonderful. It sounded terrific, but there was a massive downside. The cost of my travel guide by that time on Blurb, on a self-publishing platform, was between $86 and $91. It depended whether you got a softcover book or a hardcover book. Now, I could get an instant PDF version for $8.55 in US dollars, and an ebook, which also cost less. I shall speculate that if you consider writing books and publishing them as a money-making exercise, based on the experiences of most Canadian authors, don't give up your day job. I interrupt this special Wasaga Beach Library author talk with an important historical announcement. Fake news was invented in Wasaga Beach in the 1980s. I speak from experience involving the Enterprise Bulletin newspaper at the time. Then reporter Ben Bennett was assigned to cover an assignment at Wasaga Beach. Then Mayor Walter Borthwick and his council had called a press conference and presided over the unveiling of what they announced was a piece of the Blarney Stone from Ireland. The Enterprise Bulletin and other media did their duty and reported, sometimes including photographs, about this newest addition to Wasaga Beach tourist attractions. About a week ago, maybe just days later, it was after the reports were published and the radio and TV had aired it, that we found out the Blarney Stone unveiling in Wasaga Beach was a huge hoax. We had been tricked by Mr. Borthwick and his council. I've chuckled about it with him. Ben Bennett wrote a column about it in the next week's edition, because we only published once a week back then as a community paper. And that new version of the updated story telling the truth came out while Wasaga Beach council members were probably still chuckling. I believe that Blarney Stone is still somewhere around Wasaga Beach, perhaps at McFadden Cottages if they still exist. Not all mayors and other elected officials and municipal staff members are jokers. There are many excellent people at the municipal, provincial, and federal government levels who do good work, and Wasaga Beach is no exception. Now, any day in Canada is better for most Canadians than every day with many other residents of other countries of our planet. I do not have all the answers to all the challenges in our town or in our world, but I would like to make both a better place. And I think you would like to do that too. Trying to make Canada a better place and Canadians better Canadians is what brought me to writing Kiss the Ground You Walk On, Canada, and giving it the subtitle, The ABCs of How to Be a Better Canadian. I wanted to start a conversation. This is the book. I've got some little stickies in it, front and back, no photographs. Just at the very, very back where I'm waving goodbye, Kiss the Ground You Walk On, Canada. All I wanted to do was start a conversation with people about how we could be better Canadians. Now, this is full disclosure. I have no credentials, no official credentials for writing Kiss the Ground You Walk On, Canada, just my life experiences. I draw on my life experiences and observation to boldly suggest how we can all be better Canadians. Now, fast backward to the early 1970s. In the early 1970s, I was a reporter, photographer for the Daily Packet and Times newspaper in Orillia. The 60s had just passed, and with them changes, or changes were about to come. I can remember when people lived on farms and never locked their doors. I can remember when people had guns for hunting purposes to put food in the freezer. I can remember things that did not make sense to me, such as black to the back on buses in the United States, or water fountains, which were clearly labeled whites or coloreds. In my time, I have known people who remembered the horse and buggy days of their childhoods and the rocket-filled awe of man on the moon. There was tremendous effort to thwart the use of marijuana, and police went to great effort and expense to catch marijuana growers or users. Then came more changes to our Canadian way of life. Most people, no matter where they live today, lock their doors. More and more rules govern gun ownership. These days in the news, we have former Toronto Police Chief Bill Blair, who is now a federal government minister, telling us about steps being taken to control guns. And on the marijuana front, it's legal. Back in the late 1960s, I used to get police news by walking up to an open counter, just like in a store, at the Orillia Police Department and asking to see the docket. A policeman would show me the docket with all the listed charges, all the charges laid since the day before. I would copy out the charges that were necessary for us. And if I wanted more information, I would walk back to the locker room and talk to a police officer if he was on the shift about the charges and matters that caused those charges. Try that today. Today, police departments are not so open to the public and less open to the media than they used to be. That should worry you. It worries me. I would have never guessed decades ago, not even a few years ago, that people would be calling for defunding of police departments. Now, my book's not about that. Today, there's nowhere near the coverage of police matters in the media. Charges in provincial courts don't get reported the way they did 50, 40, 30 years ago. And in that time, I've also witnessed some other things. Church attendance dropping, and in some cases, churches closing. Changes at schools. We have gone from straps to halter straps. By that, I can remember getting the strap, yes, on one hand or the other, from the high school principal, who is probably rolling over in his grave at the dress code of some kids at schools today. One caveat here, I'm not judging the kids, just the code. Other changes I've witnessed include mammoth changes in the newspaper business and how many eligible voters turn out to cast their ballot. Years ago and through my journalism career, I was dismayed at how little attention people paid to municipal politics or even school board matters. But it is voter apathy that really bothers me the most. And there is lots of voter apathy out there. Why don't eligible voters cast their ballots? One of the reasons is they don't trust governments. People not trusting government and not voting is fodder for an entirely separate Zoom session here at the Wasaga Beach Public Library. People being frustrated by government inaction is another reason why eligible voters do not vote. Overall, in the 2019 federal election in Canada, the turnout of eligible voters was 65%, a downward trend from the previous federal election, 68% of eligible voters cast a ballot back then. To put it another way, what we have in Canada today, when it comes to voting, is a failure by numbers. About one Canadian in every 3 of eligible voters does not cast a ballot. But as they say in those television commercials, wait, there's more. In Simcoe Grey, our riding, the turnout was 64%. In Parry Sound, Muskoka, the turnout was 62%. Now for some shock treatment. In previous federal elections, there have been shockingly low turnouts of eligible voters. For example, York Simcoe, 19%, Brampton, 27%, Mississauga, 34%, So if you take 19%, that means 1 in 5 people cast a vote. 27%, 1 in 3 approximately. 34%, 1 in 3 approximately. When I wrote my first press release to promote Kiss the Ground You Walk on Canada, I think I might have been too harsh in the opening sentence. It said, "Somebody you know is killing Canada." I pointed out that what we have in Canada today is a failure by numbers, the slide in the number of eligible voters turning out to vote. At one time, the number of people turning out to vote was 75 and 80%. And in places like Prince Edward Island and the Yukon, until recent years, they still had large numbers of people, 75 and 80% turning out to vote. And that's in the federal election. I go so far as to equate that voter apathy, that low turnout, with the death of democracy. It does bother me. When I came back from some of my travels to other parts of the world and saw what happened in other parts of the world, I came back and kissed the ground I walked on. Hence the title of my book. I think a lot of people take things for granted. Freedom, food, water, free speech, healthcare, education, voting, democracy, not being spied upon. Whoa, Canada, I love it dearly. I wear the t-shirt proudly. Yes, I love the freedom that I had to solicit feedback as I started writing my book. I solicited feedback by sending out letters to the editor all over Canada, press releases to radio stations and TV stations, to their newsrooms, asking for details from Canadians about what Canadians can do to be better Canadians. I got replies from all over Canada. I even translated my queries into French and sent them to Francophone radio stations and newspapers. 36 of the replies I got are in my book, in which I offer my ABCs of how to be a better Canadian. If you read nothing else in my book, but you buy it or get it at the library, turn to page 48, where comments from Canadians, mostly from Canadians that I do not know because I solicited information from strangers. In that book, I have sections of comments, and some are from 2 guys. One is William Farley, and separately from a fellow called Kenneth McGill. While I appreciate comments from all contributors, I particularly appreciate Mr. Farley's and Mr. McGill's longer contributions. They thought things out and provided a bit more information. Mr. Farley lives in Dauphin, Manitoba. He is just beyond his mid-80s and he's lived in or visited all over Canada. I felt that was a really good guy to get information from. Mr. McGill lives in Mount Hope, Ontario. He was a Canadian Navy sailor, and Mr. McGill went on to work out a 33-year career as a Toronto firefighter. He finished his career as a district chief. To my mind, their comments alone are worth the low price of $15 for my book. And since there are no rules about how to write a book, I did whatever I wanted when I wrote my book. My focus ranged from trust to the Holocaust. I wrote about other topics, things that touch us as Canadians. I wrote about First Nations matters. This is one of the things that I've been following, and it got me thinking about writing a book about what's happened to Canadians and in particular to First Nations. So in 2010, 10 years ago, I wrote to Chuck Straw, who was then the Minister of Indian Affairs. I asked 3 simple questions to make it easy. I figured if I asked specific questions, they would give me specific replies. I asked, how many First Nations communities across Canada live with unacceptable drinking water? What steps are being taken by our federal government to remedy such cases? And then the third question, what are the deadlines for completion of such projects? It's a good thing I am a P man, nothing to do with prostate. In my case, the P stands for patient and persistent. It took me almost 2 years to receive a reply to my letter. I say to my letter because I did not receive answers to all of my questions. Instead, I received a letter from then Aboriginal Affairs Minister John Duncan. Yes, as I followed up patiently and persistently, And eventually the name of the department changed and the minister changed, and he replied, in December 2011, he told me there were 126 First Nations in Ontario, of which 28 had water systems under a drinking water advisory. He didn't answer my questions. When the next federal election brought a change of party to power, Carolyn Bennett was Minister of Indigenous Affairs. She answered my queries promptly. So I have to ask, why does it take so very long to get an answer from some politicians? More importantly, why does it take so long to remedy a long-standing problem at many First Nations communities? I was writing about this, and all while I was doing it, from month to month, I was seeing stories in the national media about situations, water woes, but First Nations. I wrote my books before Black Lives Matter was a cry that we hear today. I felt that the lives of our Canadian brothers and sisters, because I think we're all each other's brothers and sisters, at First Nations communities, they really matter too. I wrote about distracted drivers. Drives me crazy. We still have impaired drivers, and now we still have distracted drivers. I wrote and suggested a ministry of getting things done, a new ministry which would look at deadlines for getting stuff done and treat jobs to get things done like a business treats them. To get things done, politicians, governments have to work to deadlines. The subtitle of my book, Kiss the Ground You Walk on Canada, is the ABCs of how to be a better Canadian. Yes, I boldly suggested to Canadians how they can be better Canadians. And in retrospect, and based on how I'm finding things, I should have put it online with telling Canadians, oh, don't forget to brush your teeth. And oh, don't forget to change your underwear. Because telling them how to be better Canadians is kind of a risky thing, I found. I'm not going to recite to you my alphabet of how to be a better Canadian, but I shall tell you that A, the first letter, stands for two very important words. Always respect. A for always respect. Respect is so very important. I think it's one of the secrets of overcoming major hurdles. R, the letter R, is for rage. Rage against racism. Rage against discrimination. I self-published Kiss the Ground You Walk On long before the current Black Lives Matter protests and long before the current cries to defund police. In my reference to police in my latest book, I point out the ranks of the police reflect the ranks of our population. Somewhere, I am very sorry to say, there are police who are not good people. They needed to be weeded out. There are also great people in the police department. They're doing a fantastic job. But like the population, just like journalists, just like in other occupations, every once in a while there's a bad apple. If you live long enough, you will see things that you never expected to see. COVID, for example, the pandemic, who would have thought? Headlines such as a crisis in police training, no escaping pervasive racism, local journalism is critical and needs your help now. Trustworthy journalism is essential. Another headline I read. Why does it take so very long for positive things to get accomplished, if they get accomplished at all? Part of the problem is financial, but another part of the challenge is to have people make their voices heard. Demand business-like action. Business-like action. You have the power. But when 1 out of every 3 eligible voters in Canada does not cast a ballot, that makes it even more important for everybody else to get involved in the democratic process and take up causes. I'm not going to read you my book. If you purchase a copy, you can read it for yourself. So I shall not take away that potential for enjoyment. My book's available for purchase at $15 per copy plus shipping costs online at www.volumesdirect.com, which is a Canadian company based in Waterloo, Ontario. That's where I got my book printed. It's not easy to get published in Canada, but the Volume staff did make it possible and easier with their help at an affordable price. You could also buy Kiss the Ground You Walk On Canada directly from me. And as they say in advertising speak, as long as supplies last. Get your pencils ready. You could call me at 705-293-1569, 705-293-1569. On that note, I thank you for listening. I thank the Wasaga Beach Public Library for this great opportunity, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, George, for that. Very inspiring to encourage others to become involved in their politics, and especially at this time when there's so many things going on in the world and here locally as well. A lot. You've given us a lot to think about, for sure. I have so many questions, but we do have a question that's in the chat. I'll start with that one because it also overlaps with one that I had for you. Given your local involvement in your community, but also your love for Canada and your inspiration for others to be good Canadians, have you ever considered running for politics?
I was too busy in the newspaper business, not belonging, and I still don't belong to any political party. And now that I'm retired, I'm slowing down a little bit. I still wonder when I have time to work, or when I had time to work. The answer is no. I enjoy 5 grandchildren. I've been married for 52 years. We have a great time and we enjoy our time together.
Wonderful. I think you'd make a good politician. Can we convince you?
I try to answer questions truthfully without skipping around, because what I've found is that even at the municipal level seems to be easier, because like newspaper editors of community newspapers, when they had to walk down the street, they were accountable. People would pull them over and say, hey, you had that in the paper, that wasn't right. And they'd expect to see a correction in the next week's paper. And local politicians are accountable a bit more than provincial politicians, although you can still get to local politicians. And then federal politicians seem to be at a greater level, even though they have constituency offices. But what happens with some of the answers are non-answers, silence. And the only recourse we have is to vote, and not enough people are doing that.
Mm-hmm. A question that came to mind for me is, do you think that there's such a thing as an honest politician? Maybe what makes a good politician is part of the voter apathy, that we've just been disappointed over and over again with promises, and things seem to change once politicians come into office. How much of that do you think plays a role in voter apathy?
I think there are lots of politicians who are honest, just like there are honest journalists, honest policemen, honest librarians, all kinds of honest people in the world. And most people mean to do well. So I think that's a big thing. But there's a group called the Samara Center for Democracy. And I think one of the influences about people in politics not getting jobs done at the party level is that there's pressure. There's pressure from the parties for the politicians to conform. So if they don't conform, they sometimes even leave the party and cross over to another party or sit as independents, like Jody Wilson-Raybould, who toughed it out with Justin Trudeau, and then her own riding loved her. She sat as an independent and won again. Now, Samara Center for Democracy is an organization that I found out about as I worked on my book. And they do different projects, and one of them a couple of years ago, and it's a recent project, they asked federal members of parliament to identify the obstacles to getting jobs done. So I'll just name the top 5. 52% of them said they had inadequate time to consider and deliberate on policy and legislation. So if you've noticed the bickering and the fighting and the bickering back and forth, I would think they could convert that time to give them more time to do the job. But 52% of them said that was a holdback. 42% of them blamed the media for how it covers Parliament for being an obstacle to how they get the job done. 37% of federal parliamentarians said inadequate resources including office budgets, staff, and access to policy expertise. 30% said that's a problem getting a job done. Now, 31% said that their own leadership and their own staff exerted too much control and interference. And then 21% said they don't get the job done because of an adversarial relationship with MPs from other parties. So I think they have to do what they do at the local level. They have to prioritize with strategic plans what they would like to get done. Now, I'm not saying this is the total answer, because I also have a pile of strategic plans going back to 1977 for one community, and it's about a foot high. And I've seen things roll over from plan to plan to plan and never get done. But serious local politicians who don't get things done don't deserve to get reelected. So there's power at the local level, and the same thing should apply at provincial and federal levels. Just take, for example, the highway bypass between Wasaga Beach and Collingwood. That highway bypass was brought to life by the Conservatives when Jim Wilson and his group got into power. He brought to life the highway bypass that had been talked about, and there was a plan for a project talk for a bypass that would go up over the mountain and over to Blue Mountain and beyond. But the one from Collingwood and Wasaga Beach to Collingwood got started and then promptly got put on the back burner when the Dalton McGuinty Liberals got into power, and that sat for 12 years. In that time, a graded roadbed had trees growing in it, so they had to essentially waste money by grading it all over again and then redoing the road work and getting started again. We should have been taking that out of their pay. And then the Conservatives came back. The project got finished, and it's a wonderful bypass. But 12 years to do a short stretch of road, I have to say, give me a break.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't know all that. Wow. I'm sorry, just looking at the chat. Feel free to unmute yourselves if you have the question that you wanted to ask George directly. Jeffrey, do you have a question?
Hi, George. Jeff here in Vancouver.
Hi, Jeff.
From your book, you mentioned there are about a dozen things that kind of impact our lives in Canada. And in no particular order, you mention unemployment and homelessness, income per capita, sentiment, opportunities, weather, healthcare, environment, mobility, media communications, including the internet, security, including police and military, transportation, and voting. In light of all the events that have happened in 2020 with the pandemic, we're seeing a rise of nationalism south of the border and Black Lives Matter movement. Are any of these standing out to you as more impactful or less impactful since you wrote this book?
I think they're all impactful, because what's hurting right now is the pandemic for the past 4 months has been hurting us in moving forward with action on any number of fronts. We have a beautiful movement in Collingwood, and I think we have one in Wasaga Beach, that deal with out of the cold, trying to get people who are homeless out of the cold in our respective communities. And those local projects, when people can't even get together, they fall by the wayside. And the other thing that I think impacts it is back to individual responsibility. I'd like to put it that way. I think Canadians have an individual responsibility to take a look at military. In 1985, Canada's military strength was something like 59 or 65,000 troops. And that was about the size of Barrie back then. And it might be 100,000 now. I don't know what the right number is, but if you're interested in military, I think the individual responsibility is for people to take a look at military and think out what we need to get done, or talk to other people about it, or employment, or homelessness, or healthcare, or whatever, and light fires under politicians' feet. I don't mean with matches, I mean verbally, and with your vote. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question, George, and thank you for your response to that. Just looking at my questions. So if the younger generation is going to take us forward to make Canada bigger and better, how do we engage the young people as Canadians, young Canadians? What do we need to do to stir them?
That's really, really interesting, and I hold out a lot of faith. I'm the eternal optimist, and I'm probably an eternal optimist like Jeff in Vancouver, who was hoping that I would give a more detailed answer perhaps to the last question, but it would take much more time, and I'm trying to answer things in a nutshell. I hold a lot of hope out for youth, and I think one of the things that would be really helpful is if the politicians in power today tried to get to the youth more, but we don't teach properly about democracy at the high school level. We don't, until recently, we weren't even teaching about First Nations matters at the high school level. So I think there are things that we should be teaching. There are a number of other bouncing balls. If you can think of all of these little challenges as a juggler's balls going around in your hands and up in the sky, there are all these different things juggling. People are trying to make ends meet. They're trying to put food on the table. Kids are trying to get jobs, part-time jobs, to get going into university or college if they're going to go there. There are so many other things. My point is, it's easy to forget about democracy and easy to let voter apathy slide in more and more, because it has been sliding for 75 and 80% after the Second World War, down and down and down. And if you want to really get punched between the eyes by some statistics, look up provincial election statistics, where in 1977 it was 66%, and by 2011, not that long ago, it was down to 48% in provincial elections in Ontario. And in 2018, it was 58%, and in our riding, it was 57%. Municipal elections were worse. In Ontario, in 2018 municipal elections, the average, brace yourself, was 38%. 38%. In Collingwood, it was 48%. And I'm sorry to say that I don't know what the percentage was in Wasaga Beach. But if the average was 38%, then it probably wasn't much higher, if higher than Collingwood at 48. I think we have to interest young people to get more and more involved in their communities and let them know that they do have powers. If not then, coming soon. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Thinking about fake news and the responsibilities of responsible journalism, where should we look to find our news sources and trying to figure out where we lie politically?
Oh boy.
Loaded
Now
question.
no, it's not a loaded question. It's a wonderful question, because when I started in the newspaper business, I had brown hair, and now I've got gray hair, most of it from the newspaper business. I remember when I first started in the daily newspaper, the penchant for truth was overwhelming. We wanted to deliver at a daily newspaper in Ontario the truth to our readers, and people took it seriously. And I would like to think, because I did deal with daily newspapers on a provincial level and also with Canadian Press, which involved daily newspapers all across Canada, including Vancouver, Jeff. Canadian Press was a large consortium fueled by member newspapers, and the penchant was to provide real news honestly and not editorial opinion. News and editorial opinion were two different things. News was a fair report from both sides, hopefully, about what was going on. And if somebody on the other side of the story didn't want to give the truth, didn't want to reply, then we would say so-and-so didn't want to reply. Now, right up until the early 90s, I was working in the newspaper business, so weekly newspapers, daily newspapers, and then the internet hit in the early 1990s. And then fast forward to modern day, we have some internet newspapers, and I'm not saying internet newspapers are bad. I know some reporters that were in the old time newspapers and now work in the new type of newspaper. And now they're multimedia specialists. They not only have to report for their online newspaper, but they have to do video for perhaps a member station, because there's been a consolidation of ownership. People have been buying up and buying up. Little community newspapers have disappeared pretty much as we know them at our fingertips, and online newspapers are filling the void. So I think there are some good online newspapers. Simcoe.com has newspapers in Wasaga and Collingwood, and reporters there provide information. I think those kind of newspapers are bringing you the truth. They're working hard to bring the truth, and they are responsible. And Collingwood today, another one that I'm familiar locally, is a business model that is expanding like Topsy. They probably have 6 or 7 now. Those newspapers are trying to bring truth. Here's where the rub is. The internet can be such a vociferous place, a vituperative place, a nasty place. I've watched people attacking politicians on Wasaga Beach websites, and people that were trying to do a good job for Wasaga Beach were getting roasted verbally. And some of the things were actually could have ended in court, I would think, because you couldn't say some of those things in real life, but people think you can put it on the internet and get away with it. Well, the day of reckoning will come when people sue people for what they put on the internet. So now, if I had to give a nutshell answer, you have to watch where your news source is coming from, because there are some really, really difficult ones there. And some places that are out there, International Democrat Party, I'd like to know what they do. Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper was the chairman of that group. It's a worldwide organization of people like Stephen Harper. And I wrote to them twice and asked them what they do, and asked them to respond, and asked them to send me an answer about how they're financed. And all I got was silence, even though I registered the second letter. But there are places where you will not get an answer. And maybe that place doesn't make a big difference to our lives, but I strike out and ask questions. I suggested recently, when the Toronto Star did a story about 2 local politicians, one in Milton and one in another riding, I wrote to those politicians and I suggested that I'd like to check with them a year from now, and 2 years from now, and 3 years from now, and ask them what they've accomplished in their ridings. Now, people in any riding across Canada should maybe do that and hold their respective politicians accountable. Now, I'm talking about the federal level right now. I've got 2 politicians in mind, and come next October, I'm going to write them a letter and say, what did you accomplish? And let's see if they write back, because those 2 politicians haven't even written back to me yet. But that's food for fodder for another story.
Yeah, a report card would be great.
That's right.
Yeah, I agree. That brings a question to mind that I had written down. Some of the questions that you asked initially back in 2010, I wonder what the answer would be, in particular when you wrote about the question asking how many communities have unacceptable drinking water. At that time, I think your answer that you got several years later after asking the question was 126 First Nations. I wonder what that number would be now if you asked that question today.
That's a very good question, because I left that out of my speech, hoping somebody would ask that question. Because today, I remember I mentioned Carolyn Bennett. The Indigenous Affairs Ministry got split into a couple of ministries. It's now Crown Indigenous Relations, with Carolyn Bennett as the Member of Parliament, the minister, and Indigenous Services Canada with Mark Miller as the minister, and Northern Affairs enters into it a bit, but they really upped the ante in giving answers. And I think they did something that is extremely commendable. So thanks to Carolyn Bennett, and I don't know her personally, but I just know she's written to me and answered questions. Anybody can click into their website and can look up and find the same information I have. So I asked the question, what's happening with water woes in Canada? And as of as of February 15th, 2020, there were 61 long-term drinking water advisories in effect. And that's pretty good, considering what we had before. I didn't have a full answer before, but it was a lot more. The really good news is that Carolyn Bennett and her ministry have set a deadline for getting things rectified for those First Nations communities that are so unfortunate to have water woes. The deadline for having everything fixed, not some of them, everything, is March 2021. I've got a date booked on my calendar. You should date book it on your calendar, and it's there for you to see on their website.
That's great. That's an issue that strikes me as being very important and certainly very Canadian, that I think we just take for granted our fresh supply water, and how many of us know that all Canadians don't have access to clean, safe drinking water. So I think that's something we definitely need to be strong with our voice about and demand some action. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
I should add, if we had a place in Southern Ontario that had unsafe drinking water tomorrow, I would hazard a guess that by the weekend it would be fixed. And then flip to Northern Ontario, to Ottawa-Piscat and communities up there that are having problems. And I'm talking about problems year after year after year. It's still not fixed.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Very sad. Shouldn't be that way, should it?
No.
I'm just going to jump back to the chat box, so I don't want to hog you with my questions. A question from Jeffrey again. Do you believe election reform would bring new voters, first past the post versus proportional voting? What do you think?
Yes, I think we should try first past the post. Proportional voting. That leads me to another aspect, mandatory voting. Some people say we should have mandatory voting. They have it in Australia. If you don't vote, you get fined. And I think we should try something else, but I don't think we should try mandatory voting, because then people aren't putting thought into it. They're trying to just get away from the fine. So that's my answer to that question. I wouldn't vote in favor of mandatory voting.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. How do you feel about climate change? Should governments be more aggressive in tackling this? How about climate change in Canada and where we stand as Canadians with that?
Well, I think what people should do is they should ask, how can we fix climate change? By standing in front of the mirror and asking the person in the mirror. Because we're so busy. We take it for granted that other people are going to fix things. What I want to do is I'd like to see it fast forwarded, that we have individual responsibility, that people get more and more involved in their communities and more involved to the point that they tell politicians it's not acceptable if we don't deal with climate change.
Agreed. Yeah. Anybody else have a question they wanted to ask? Feel free to unmute yourselves and ask your question, or use the chat box.
While you're thinking, I'll tell you that it's 690 kilometers around Georgian Bay, if you go around clockwise, plus 43 kilometers on the Chichiman from Tobermory to South Baymouth. Questions, please.
I had a question. You mentioned 2 Canadians that you involved in your book, which I love that this was a collaborative effort in some respects from Canadians across Canada that had the opportunity to contribute to your book. Have you ever had further conversations with the 2 gentlemen that you mentioned, the one in Manitoba and the one in Mount Hope?
The one in Manitoba, I have sent him emails and not had a reply. And the one in Mount Hope, I've had conversations with him, and it's been a wonderful thing to meet a person and talk to him about the book and about things we hold dear. He was in the Navy. He loves Canada. He's been in other places. He knows what it's like in some other countries.
Yes. All veterans are proud Canadians, and we certainly need to look to them for their knowledge and experience. And
Speaking of veterans, in my book, I write about trying to get, I thought an easy thing would be to deal with the Legion, because Legion, the Royal Canadian Legion, which I greatly respect, and my dad was a veteran, and I dealt with different legions in different parts of Canada. And when I came to writing the book, I sent a letter to the National Command, and I asked if they could communicate to other Legion branches all over Canada and be a go-between and ask their respective communities about how people could be better Canadians. And I thought that would give Legions a chance to work on a project, give them a higher profile, maybe get some more members, and bring in a youthful aspect. And I got a letter from Legion to Command saying, sorry, we can't get involved. And that shocked me. They don't get involved because they don't pass solicitations on to member legions all over Canada. I thought that kind of defied common sense. They should look at solicitation requests item by item, but I have a vested interest. I'm biased towards mine.
mm-hmm. So I'm just answering a question here in the chat box. Thank you for that. Any further questions? I know George talked a little bit about his experience as a writer and publisher, self-publishing. Do we have any writing questions from any writers that might be in the group? Thank you for sharing your experience. It's interesting to kind of observe your comments from what you've experienced in the writing field over time, and also in the newspaper industry. It's been an interesting perspective to hear that change that you've witnessed over time. It's fascinating to hear those changes.
If anybody has any questions after the show, I'd be happy to field them by email at Georgian Blue, just like Georgian Bay and Blue Mountain, georgianblue@rogers.com, or through your library. Perfect. And they know where the Wasaga Library is, so.
Yeah.
I greatly thank Jeff in particular, all the way from Vancouver, through the miracle of Zoom, and you, Angela, for connecting us all.
Well, thank you. It is nice to have that representation right across the country as we talk about Canada, and definitely love that aspect for Zoom to bring people together, certainly with what's going on with COVID right now. And this might be the new way. Maybe one final question. How do you think we've responded to COVID as Canadians? Is it the Canadian way? Have we raised the bar for everybody else, or how have we done as Canadians in responding to COVID?
I'm going to judge by our community because I know it best. I think we've done a very, very good job. And in general, from what I can see across Canada, I think people in general have been very, very careful. And I love the cartoon in the Toronto Star the other day, which showed a beaver holding up against a gate, holding the gate closed, and the beaver was in Canada and America was on the other side of the gate. Because in America, you can see what's been happening with the flare-ups, and we haven't been that dumb in Canada.
As dumb.
Yeah, I think someone's agreeing with you there for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely, I think we've done well as Canadians. I think we can be proud. We have a lot to be proud of in general as Canadians. And thank you, George, for inspiring us to do what we can do to be better Canadians. I think the message to take away is that we all have a voice, and now is the time to express it. And let's unite and make some noise about what's important to us as Canadians, and take some action, demand accountability from our politicians, and let's, I guess it's hard to hit everything that's important, but let's figure out what's important and make a difference and get out and vote.
Absolutely.
and put those people into power that can make differences for us as Canadians, and the ones that are accountable and have the action plan and the deadline in place to give us that report card that the job's been done. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. If there's no further questions, and I do want to especially thank all of you who've joined us from a distance tonight. And thank you very, very much, George, for joining us.
My pleasure. And
sharing
thank you very
your-
much.
George.
Thanks, George.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank
Be well,
you.
Stay safe.
Yeah, stay safe, everybody. And we hope to see you again in a virtual program sometime soon with the Wasaga Beach Public Library.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Keep up the excellent work.
Thank you, George. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.